Writers of history books can be flawed, short-sighted, or even, shocker, a little biased. So some of history's key players have been left out of the story. We think it's time to write them back in. When discussing the civil rights movement, we often don't mention Bayard Rustin, like, ever. He was a nonviolent activist who advised Martin Luther King and was integral to organizing the 1963 March on Washington. Why don't we know more about him? Well,
he is black, gay, socialist, pacifist, right? Like, he's actually America's worst nightmare.
Yeah, that'll do it. As a young adult, Rustin joined the Young Communist League, which turned him into a political liability during the McCarthy era. Never mind that he left the Communist Party in 1941. Then there was his 1953 arrest and conviction for lewd conduct with other men. As a result, he was pushed to resign from the American Friends Service Committee.
I think that Bayard Rustin is one of the people who's kind of almost criminally under-recognized.
Like, under-recognized to the point where he was a principal organizer on the March on Washington. You know, the I Have a Dream speech march? Homophobia was a serious problem for Rustin, and opponents of the March on Washington tried to spread a rumor that his complex relationship with Dr. King was somehow romantic. Rustin resigned from King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but set aside what must have been a painful rejection and came back to work for King. Even so, he was often pushed to the side or intentionally left out of the narrative, for fear that political opponents would use his political history and his life as an openly gay man to damage the movement. He died in 1987, largely forgotten from the civil rights movement. Even so, President Ronald Reagan released a statement on his passing, praising him for promoting human rights throughout the world. If everyone understood how close we came to World War III, not once, but twice, you might never sleep.
It could have very well meant the end of humanity.
Consider the cases of Vasily Arkhipov and Stanislav Petrov. Arkhipov was an officer on a Soviet submarine in October 1962 in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis. His sub encountered a U.S. destroyer that began dropping depth charges to get the Soviets to surface. The submariners couldn't reach Moscow for confirmation. They thought war might have broken out. Should they fire a nuclear torpedo? Two of the three senior officers aboard thought yes, but Arkhipov, the second captain, refused.
Do I have your permission?
No.
Without his approval, the torpedo had to stay in its tube. A good thing, because there was no war. 2 decades later, on September 26, 1983, Stanislav Petrov was a lieutenant colonel on watch in a sleepy military outpost. In the middle of the night, he was shocked when the early warning system went off, warning that 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles had seemingly been launched by the US toward the USSR. If Petrov had reported the alarm to command, there was no time to reach out to the Americans before retaliating. But Petrov clocked it as a false alarm and did nothing. Good thing, too, as a combined death toll of US and Soviet strikes would have been in the hundreds of millions, with many more likely dying in the aftermath. You might know the Petrov story, but here's the forgotten part. Only a few weeks earlier, the Soviets shot down Korean Air Flight 007, killing all 246 passengers, including a US congressman. So it's not like retaliation was out of the question, but Petrov made the right call, and we're still here today. From a U.S. perspective, the end of slavery is inextricably tied up with the American Civil War. But in Britain, it had already been debated. An 18th century politician, William Wilberforce, was one of the most vocal anti-enslavement campaigners. He didn't start out that way, though. Wilberforce was apparently a nice but sort of aimless young man when he was a student at Cambridge. In 1780, he was elected to the House of Commons, where he became increasingly outspoken about political reform. After converting to evangelical Christianity, he became a staunch abolitionist and co-founded the Anti-Slavery Society. He routinely sponsored anti-slavery bills in Parliament. His first few speeches attracted attention, but his bills never passed into law. Still, Wilberforce and his cause were gaining traction. By 1792, he'd managed to secure a sort of compromise in which slavery would eventually be abolished throughout the British Empire, though even that seemed to stall until 1807, when a bill to ban slavery in the British West Indies actually passed, and the slave trade was technically over. But this didn't free anyone who was already enslaved, so Wilberforce and company kept at it. In fact, he was still working to free the enslaved in 1825 when he retired from politics. Fortunately, Wilberforce lived long enough to see the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act pass and free enslaved people in nearly all British territories.
Nose to the left, 16. Eyes to the right, 283.
The act also declared Canada a free territory, making it a desirable destination for any enslaved person fleeing the United States. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration estimates that between 1975 and 2017, nearly 375,000 people were saved by seatbelts. So who's to thank? That would be Nils Bohlin, the Swedish engineer who created the three-point seatbelt, which was first used in 1959 in, of course, the Volvo. You know what they say.
Buy Volvos. They're boxy, but they're good.
Before that, seatbelts, if people bothered to use them, were a simple two-point lap belt that sometimes caused serious internal injuries in a crash. Bohlin had designed ejector seats for planes before Volvo hired him to address the problem. The whole thing, between design and testing, took him about a year. The result was the three-point belt, which secured passengers more effectively and was easy to use one-handed. Volvo made Bohlin's design available to other car makers for free. In the US, seatbelts were mandatory parts of vehicle design from 1968 onward.
I think what mattered to him was that children's lives were better and longer and healthier. That's all that mattered to him.
Maurice Hilleman developed over 40 vaccines, including the MMR, a combined vaccine for measles, mumps, and rubella that you likely received when you were a kid. In fact, Hilleman had a major hand in creating or markedly improving 9 of the 14 vaccines that are now standard for US children. He also helped prevent what could have been a major flu pandemic in 1957 with the creation of some 40 million doses of a targeted flu vaccine.
Arguably the greatest scientist of the 20th century. Most people have never heard his name.
You probably don't know much about Dr. Hilleman because he wasn't into self-promotion. One of the few personal touches he brought to his research was sampling the mumps virus from his own daughter, Gerald Lynn, in 1963. He named the strain, which replaced a far less effective vaccine, after her. In Vienna, 1844, Ignaz Semmelweis received his medical degree, and soon after beginning work at an obstetric clinic, he encountered puerperal fever, a serious postpartum infection that was often fatal to new mothers. Women who delivered in a hospital faced the worst odds, with mortality rates as high as 30%. Still, many doctors shrugged their shoulders and just accepted that women were just going to keep on dying. But Semmelweis decided to do something about it. At first, he considered whether differences in birthing positions or even pre-scaring patients were to blame, but found no supporting evidence.
Then, an associate performing an autopsy on a patient who died of puerperal fever cut himself mid-procedure and died of a similar infection, leading Semmelweis to conclude that the two deaths were caused by the same pathogen.
And he was right. He ordered medical students to disinfect their hands with a chlorinated solution before examining patients, and death rates immediately plummeted from 18.27% in one ward to just 1.27%. This might seem obvious today, wash your hands, but what's lost is that the entire reason everyone started washing their hands was because of Semmelweis. Regular hand washing is only about 175 years old. Tragically, Semmelweis faced major opposition from his colleagues. Perhaps this is what triggered a variety of escalating mental health issues that got so bad that in 1865 he was committed to an asylum at just 47 years old. Semmelweis died just 2 weeks later, ironically due to an infected wound. There's one figure in the field of paleontology who doesn't get nearly enough recognition. Upon first glance, Mary Anning may have seemed like any other woman living in the seaside town of Lyme Regis on the southwestern coast of England, but she was also a fossil hunter. Fossils sometimes emerged from the crumbling cliffs near her town, leading some to risk the frequent rock slides in search of interesting specimens. That's how Mary's father Richard supported the family. When Richard died in 1810, Mary and her brother Joseph continued fossil hunting, finding an ichthyosaur over the course of 1811 and 1812. Mary herself discovered a nearly complete plesiosaur fossil in 1823, but while scientists at the prestigious Geological Society of London debated its authenticity, Anning wasn't invited. Likewise, she was rarely credited by collectors or museums. Eventually, though, tourists began making special trips to see Anning and her fossil shop. She earned some recognition for her carefully observed finds, including pterosaur fossils, coprolites, or fossilized poop, and small marine creatures, though she struggled financially all her life. She died of breast cancer in 1847. Before 1921, cars often experienced engine trouble known as knocking, but engineer Thomas Midgley Jr. had a solution: lead. Specifically, he proposed adding tetraethyl lead, or TEL, to gasoline to increase engine efficiency and do away with that terrible knocking noise. Actually, ethanol seemed like the best option, but Midgley's employer, General Motors, didn't like that it couldn't patent ethanol, so TEL it was. Who cared if it was a known toxin and spewed lead out of a car's exhaust? Clair Patterson did. He was a geochemist at Caltech and published a 1965 paper revealing high levels of lead in the environment due to human activity. According to him, the average American at the time was so full of the stuff that they were teetering on the edge of toxicity. He even examined ancient human remains and compared lead levels there to modern samples, confirming that modern humans had far higher lead exposure. Patterson realized that TEL deposited via engine exhaust, as well as other sources like industrial production, was everywhere. In 1970, Patterson testified before the U.S. Senate, where his research provided factual support for the passage of the Clean Air Act of 1970.
It's said he saved as many as 1 billion people from starvation.
If you've ever studied agriculture in history or science class, you've probably heard of the Agricultural Revolution. But do you know about Norman Borlaug? The Green Revolution saw a massive increase in crop yields, but without Borlaug, it might never have happened.
The greatest challenge to the human family is the race between food supply and population increase.
Borlaug started out as a forestry student at the University of Minnesota, but by 1944 he was a geneticist directing the Cooperative Wheat Research and Production Program and stationed in Mexico. Under his direction, the team began churning out wheat hybrids in the quest to develop a disease-resistant, high-yield variety. The result proved successful not just in Mexico, but across the globe. Borlaug shared these wheat seeds with interested nations, with the stipulation that they set up research and graduate-level agricultural science programs. For both his scientific research and humanitarian efforts to combat worldwide hunger, Borlaug was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970.
She was the ultimate agitator, and feared because of it.
Ida B. Wells was born in 1862 in Mississippi. We don't need to explain to you what that means, but once her entire family was free, her parents, Elizabeth and James Wells, were focused on education and community work.
Ida's mother attended school alongside her 8 children until she could read.
Her father joined the Freedmen's Aid Society and helped found Rust College, a historically black institution still operating in Holly Springs, Mississippi. Ida attended Rust College, but she had to drop out at 16 when her parents died of yellow fever. Later, after working as a teacher and taking care of her remaining family, Wells enrolled at Nashville's Fisk University. While traveling to Nashville in 1884 on a first-class ticket, train personnel tried to force Wells into a segregated car. She fought back and was kicked off the train. She sued and won, but the Tennessee Supreme Court overturned the verdict. Wells began publishing articles on race and segregation under a pseudonym, and eventually owned 2 newspapers while still working as a teacher in Memphis. When her work came to light in 1891, she was fired from her teaching job. But still, Wells didn't stop. Instead, she began openly criticizing the lynching of black Americans and began a new career as an investigative journalist. On one occasion, an angry mob stormed her newspaper offices and trashed the place. Wells, who was in New York at the time, permanently moved away from the American South, but she never stopped writing. Her largely forgotten legacy is making the world aware of lynching. Yes, the world. She even traveled to England to let everyone know what was going on in the Deep South. Look, if you hate going to the doctor, imagine how much worse it would be if that doctor thought the human anatomy was pretty much the same as a sheep's. Thanks to the ancient Greek physician Galen, doctors thought that way for centuries. In Galen's defense, he was doing his best in a society that condemned human dissection, so he did what he figured was the next best thing. He cracked open a sheep's skull, figuring a head was a head. So how did we get from there to here? You can thank Andreas Vesalius, a doctor in Renaissance Europe who was allowed to dissect human remains and was willing to entertain a nearly heretical idea. By 1543, Vesalius's richly illustrated anatomy textbook, which is in Latin and I'm not about to say all those words, so we'll just call it the Fabrica, was nothing short of revolutionary. With artistic and scientific achievements that included paper flaps, allowing readers to examine the different aspects of human anatomy in sequence. Eventually, Vesalius served as physician to Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and managed to produce a follow-up anatomical text known as the Epitome. The 1876 Battle of Little Bighorn saw the Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne face off against U.S. Army troops led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. But there were a small number of women fighting for the Lakota and Cheyenne. The most striking accounts are about Buffalo Calf Road Woman, sometimes also called Buffalo Calf Trail Woman. In 1967's With Custer on the Little Bighorn, an eyewitness account reads, "She was the only woman there who had a gun. She was the only woman I know of who went with the warriors to that fight." According to accounts from the Northern Cheyenne, Buffalo Calf Road Woman may have actually knocked Custer himself off his horse. She may also have been among a group of women who moved through the battlefield and finished off wounded soldiers, Custer included. Buffalo Calf Road Woman died of illness in May 1879. Around 1760, James Armistead was born in Virginia. We say around because this story is going to get a little bit murky. You see, James was born to an enslaved woman and ended up with John Armistead, and later with his son William. No one is really certain how old he really was, with some placing his birth back in 1748. This much we know. James could read and write and was pretty cunning. With the arrival of the Revolution, he enlisted in a colonial unit associated with the Marquis de Lafayette, becoming a spy. It was a complex situation. Up to 8,000 black men fought for the Continental Army, but another estimated 20,000 joined up with the more overtly anti-slavery British. James's personal motivations are impossible to know. What we do know is that he gained unprecedented access to British sources, passed vital intelligence to the Continental Army, gave the British bad information, and even worked for the traitor Benedict Arnold. In 1781, Armistead warned Lafayette and George Washington that British reinforcements were on their way to the Battle of Yorktown. The rebels managed to head off these new troops, leading to a decisive colonial victory. Lafayette thought highly of James, writing in 1784, "He appears to me entitled to every reward his situation could admit of." But Armistead was forced to return to being enslaved because his undercover intelligence work disqualified him from the emancipation granted to other soldiers. It wasn't until 1787, when Lafayette again stepped in, that Armistead was granted freedom. The general was so instrumental in Armistead's life that he added Lafayette's name to his own in appreciation. We know him today as James Armistead Lafayette, but he never actually used Armistead himself as a last name. We don't even know exactly when he died, either in 1830 or 1832, but his contributions to the Battle of Yorktown were critical to the success of the Rebs. Would you rather live in a London of cesspits and open drainage channels full of all manner of waste, or one with covered sewers? You better have chosen B. But who do we have to thank for such a civilized development? Joseph Bazalgette might not have invented enclosed sewers, but his extensive redesign of London's sewer system in the mid-19th century almost certainly saved thousands or even millions of lives. That's because by the 1850s, London was prone to epidemics of cholera, a deadly disease that festers and grows in unsanitary conditions. In summer 1858, hot weather basically cooked all that open water, creating a stench so stomach-churning that it became known as the Great Stink. This was apparently the last straw for city organizers, who got to work fixing the notoriously bad sewer system. In 1852, Bazalgette was elected as the Metropolitan Board of Works engineer and got to work redesigning the 1,300 miles of pre-existing sewer lines and a woefully inadequate drainage system. Bazalgette rerouted sewage to treatment plants, and by the 1870s, embankments he'd constructed along the Thames reclaimed over 50 acres of tidal flats, protecting portions of the new sewer, providing new land for development, and making room for the all-important underground rail system to come. Remarkably, many vaccines, medications, and other treatments that relied on human cell cultures to get their start all come back to the controversial story of a woman named Henrietta Lacks. Lacks was a Baltimore housewife and mother of 5. In early 1951, she went to the Johns Hopkins Hospital, one of the few institutions in that area that treated low-income black people, because she was bleeding. Doctors found a large malignant tumor on her cervix. They took a cell sample, sending it to a Johns Hopkins lab without her knowledge. That's the key part to the story. Despite undergoing an early form of radiation treatment, the 31-year-old Lacks died of cancer that same year. However, her cell line, sent to the lab of Dr. George Guy, lived on and on. Unlike previous cell lines, Lacks' cancer cells were incredibly resilient. Named HeLa cells, they were shared with many other labs and proved instrumental in future scientific and medical research. HeLa cells played a role in the development of the polio vaccine, treatments for sickle cell anemia, HIV medications, and vaccines for HPV, which can lead to some forms of cervical cancer.
Her cells were the first ever cloned, her genes some of the first ever mapped. They were used to help develop in vitro fertilization.
But Lacks' contribution to medical science wasn't recognized until the early 2000s. Back in those days, patients were rarely, if ever, informed their cells would be used for any scientific study, and you can rest assured that there's no way they'd tell a poor black girl of their intentions. The only reason anyone really knows about her is because of a 2010 book about her and the HeLa name convention. It comes from the first 2 letters of her name, Henrietta Lacks.
It's the greatest encryption device in history, and the Germans use it for all communications.
For much of World War II, German forces communicated via the Enigma machine, which scrambled messages into an incomprehensible mess to anyone without a cipher. Today, if you read about the Enigma code, you'll see mention of the British team at Bletchley Park, where mathematician Alan Turing played a key role in cracking the code. But Turing and his team weren't the first to figure out the Enigma. That honor goes to a Polish team headed by mathematician Marian Rejewski. Poland had been attempting to break into German Enigma communications since the 1920s, using mathematical models instead of more common linguistic ones. The Polish Cipher Bureau recruited former student Rejewski, along with 2 others, Jerzy Rejewski and Henryk Jagielski. When this team got a hold of an Enigma manual and a couple months' worth of German Enigma settings, Rejewski finally figured out how the machine worked. But their success was thwarted in October 1936 when the Germans began changing the code every day instead of every 3 months, and later increased the complexity of the machine. Still, Rejewski and his team managed to decrypt the vast majority of Nazi plans before the Germans invaded Poland in September 1939. At that point, their work was passed on to teams in the safer territories of France and Britain. Penicillin's antibiotic quality was first identified in 1928, when British bacteriologist Alexander Fleming returned from vacation and found that pathogens in a petri dish left in his lab were killed off by a strain of Penicillium mold. But it wasn't until the 1940s that it was developed as an antibiotic. With the threat of war looming, someone had to figure out how to make a lot of penicillin fast. Scientists, pharmaceutical companies, and the US government developed a tank-based submersion method that produced higher yields. Amongst this group was a chemical engineer from Pfizer named Margaret Hutchinson Rousseau. She brought together her industrial design experience with a penicillin problem to create a deep tank fermentation process that allowed for commercial-level production of penicillin. By June 1945, more than 646 billion units of the drug were produced each year, thanks in part to Rousseau's invention. Rousseau also designed production processes for synthetic rubber, another key wartime material, and was the first American woman to earn a doctorate in chemical engineering. If you find yourself at war, you better control your supply lines. When it came time for the Union to think about this during the American Civil War, it was Herman Haupt who came to the rescue. Haupt, who came from a humble background, graduated from West Point in 1835, but he quickly resigned his Army commission to become a railroad engineer. Soon, he was devising mathematical models for testing bridge strength and coming up with other high-level engineering ideas and custom-built equipment. Financial difficulties made things rough for Haupt and his family, but in the 1860s, he was invited to Washington, D.C. to oversee the construction of railroads for a Union already at war. It was especially tricky because the US didn't have a well-connected rail network and was beset by quarreling rail companies, which obviously necessitated the construction and defense of new lines. Haupt was made a brigadier general, which brought him into occasional conflict with other officers who weren't happy to just let Haupt do his job, even if it was the vital work of transporting supplies and troops. Haupt resigned in 1863, apparently uncomfortable with the limitations of military bureaucracy, but the men who trained under him were able to keep the railroads running through the end of the war. In 1944, Swedish businessman Raoul Wallenberg saw the Nazi persecution of Hungarian Jewish people and managed to secure a diplomatic post in Budapest with the intent of saving as many as he could. He was able to help thousands of Jewish people shelter in homes under the protection of neutral countries, but we don't know how many. Estimates range from a low of about 4,000 to as many as 35,000. Wallenberg interrupted deportations to concentration camps and distributed supplies, including food and clothing. He used his diplomatic status and bureaucratic ties to get people safe passage out of danger, sometimes even forging the necessary papers. While he was hardly the only person in Hungary and beyond doing this sort of work, Wallenberg's story remains haunting because we don't know exactly what happened to him. He was in Budapest in 1945 when the Soviets took the city. Red Army officials appear to have grown suspicious and identified Wallenberg as a spy, arresting him in January on charges of espionage. Or, as some accounts suggest, he was under military escort and technically not under arrest. Either way, patchy post-war records indicate that he was held in prison until 1947, when he reportedly died of a heart attack in his cell. As far as much of the world was concerned, Wallenberg simply disappeared in the chaotic aftermath of the war. It wasn't until 2016 that Sweden officially declared him dead. Enheduanna lived in ancient Mesopotamia more than 4,000 years ago.
She was the daughter of empire builder Sargon of Akkad and served as the high priestess of the Temple of Ur, a city in Sumeria.
This meant Enheduanna had to combine Sumerian and Akkadian religious traditions while supporting her father's expansionist projects. It was tricky, and in one of her poems, she claims a political troublemaker temporarily forced Enheduanna into exile. In the Exaltation of Inanna, she credits the titular goddess for returning her to power. Enheduanna wrote religious hymns and influenced many later works. Besides the Exaltation of Inanna, she's also credited with writing The Great-Hearted Mistress and Goddess of the Fearsome Powers, all three of which are meant to honor Inanna along with around 42 other poems.
Interestingly, this Inanna wasn't the one the Sumerians of old worshipped.
As we said, Enheduanna melded Sumerian and Akkadian traditions, goddesses included, which kept her in power for over 4 decades and established her legacy as history's first known author.